On the afternoon of March 4th, 2010, 30-year-old Amos LeDuc was walking his 5-year-old daughter back home from daycare in the tiny Leech Lake Indian Reservation town of Cass Lake, Minnesota. It was a warm morning by Minnesota standards, but there was still snow on the ground as they trotted along Tract 34. Earlier in the day, Amos had noticed a person mean-mugging him from a vehicle, but he didn't think much of it. That is, until he noticed another vehicle pulling up behind him, and a man, armed with a .40 caliber pistol and wearing latex gloves, jump out and charge towards him. Amos picked up his daughter and ran for his life as the gunman began to fire. Bullets whizzed past him as he continued to run in a straight line, giving his assailant a clear shot. He made it only a few more steps before he was struck by gunfire and fell to the ground, catapulting the little girl a few feet forward as he hit the pavement. The shooter continued to fire, but Amos LeDuc was lucky that day. It just so happened that a retired tribal officer named John Wind was driving a Chevy Avalanche down Tract 34 at that very moment and noticed the foot chase and the shooting. John Wind made a split-second decision to do something heroic. He pulled his vehicle in between Amos and the shooter, hurtling both victims into the vehicle and speeding off to a local hospital. Amos LeDuc had been struck 3 times, but his daughter was fortunate. Though one of the rounds hit her backpack and she suffered scrapes from the fall, the little girl suffered no gunshot wounds. As John Wind asked Amos questions to keep him awake, she screamed, "Wake up, Daddy," throughout the drive to the hospital. Amos survived, but the shooting would have grave implications for years to come. While Amos LeDuc was being tended to, police were on their way to solving the crime. As it turned out, the shooter, William Odie Morris, had run off in the confusion, while the vehicle he was in sped off in a different direction. Police found Morris and the latex gloves he'd been wearing, and they soon identified the suspected driver, a man named Anthony Francis Cree, also known as Pun. It turned out that both Morris and Cree had something in common: affiliation with a fast-growing Midwest gang known as the Native Mob, widely considered at the time to be the most dominant Native American gang in the United States. Since 2004, the FBI and DEA had been monitoring the Native Mob with some interest, taking notes and collecting evidence just as they did with countless other gangs in the region. But after the Amos LeDuc shooting, that investigation was ratcheted into high gear. The federal government decided it would use the RICO statute to do its best to take down the Native Mob, and the main target would be its chief, a Minnesota native whom authorities blamed for bringing organization to the mob and uniting its different geographic factions under a common purpose. Soon, the U.S. Department of Justice would secure a federal indictment alleging 10 years' worth of crimes committed by Native Mob members, including the murder of a fellow Native Mob member, shot in the head as he and his killer walked through the snow in Minneapolis. But before we get into all of that, let's set the stage for how this group came to exist in the first place. For centuries in Minnesota, 2 primary indigenous tribes have existed: the Lakota, also commonly known as Dakota, and the Ojibwe, also known as Chippewa, Ojibwe, and Ojibwa. So much of Minnesota's history traces back to indigenous people, including the name Minnesota itself. But in the mid-1800s, most of the state's native population was forced into reservations along the Mississippi River as the non-native population increased by 28-fold. The year 1862 saw a 6-week armed conflict known as the U.S.-Dakota War, during which the state's governor literally advocated, quote, extermination of Native Americans. Over the years, indigenous people of the Midwest were killed, forcibly relocated, stripped of land rights, kept in prison camps, and robbed of their culture and heritage through boarding schools that were mandatory for Native youths, all at the hands of the United States government. Today, Native Americans have the highest poverty rate of any ethnicity in Minnesota, the lowest life expectancy, and make up roughly 10% of the state's prison population, despite being just 1% of the overall population statewide. In the Leech Lake Reservation, where the Amos LeDuc shooting occurred, the unemployment rate was nearly double that of the country's in 2010, and the median household income was nearly $10,000 less than that of the United States as a whole. A local attorney named Timothy Aldrich testified at a RICO trial that he'd seen countless indigenous youths join gangs in his career for similar reasons. Quote, the simplest way to put it is this. People who are hurt people. And the community, the Native community, has experienced a lot of trauma and have this pain within them that seems to be carried out as internalized oppression. That brings us to the Native mob. The gang started in the mid-1990s as an offshoot of the Vice Lords, but only with a handful of members. The Vice Lords, one of the best-known gangs in the United States, apparently started aggressively recruiting from Minnesota's indigenous population after members of the gang murdered Minneapolis police officer Jerry Hoff in retaliation for an act of police brutality by another officer, leading to a huge government crackdown against the Vice Lords. As time went on, what came to be known as the Native Vice Lords branched off to form its own thing, and ultimately dropped the Vice Lords title altogether in favor of the names Native Kings or Native Mob. At any rate, by the early 2000s, the group had spread throughout Minnesota, primarily occupying Red Lake, Leech Lake, Cass Lake, White Earth, Fond du Lac, Duluth, South Minneapolis, and other communities. It is organized by titles like Ogema, the Ojibwe word for chief, as well as co-chief, war chief, treasurer, sergeant-at-arms, enforcer, and reps, who literally represent their respective geographic regions and are responsible for communicating with the higher-ups in the gang. It uses symbols like a medicine wheel, with the letters N and M, and claims the colors black and red, and members are known to wear Milwaukee Brewers hats because the logo spells out M-O-B. The Native mob has on-again, off-again conflicts with the Native gangster Disciples, the Project Boys, and other rivals that have lasted for years. But one reason why the gang hadn't popped up too far on the Fed's radar prior to 2010, though, was its general lack of organization. In 2005, the Native mob's co-founder, Wambly MacArthur, was sentenced to 30 years in prison for murdering 20-year-old Vincent LaRocque at the Little Earth housing complex in Minneapolis. That left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by Gordon G. Money Reese. But while Reese was credited by some with having helped start the Native mob, the next 2 years saw infighting within the gang, as members of different geographical factions argued about who was really in the gang. The following year, Reese was indicted and ultimately convicted of running an extensive drug ring. He was given 30 years in federal prison. Once again, that left a void in the leadership of the Native mob. And this time, the man who stepped in to fill it had a grand vision that would unite the gang and expand it beyond anything in its history. This is where Wakinyan Wakan MacArthur enters our story. Known commonly by the nickname Con, Wakinyan MacArthur had instant credibility as Wambly MacArthur's younger brother. But he'd made a name for himself in other ways too. On December 30th, 1994, when he was just 15 years old, Con got into an argument with someone at a house party on 18th Street South in Minneapolis. So he pulled out a gun and fired a shot. He didn't hit his intended target, but the bullet struck 29-year-old Stacy Rivers, who died the next day. Con was charged with murder, sentenced to 12.5 years. But because of his young age, a judge agreed to stay his sentence and give him probation, with the agreement that he could end up serving the full term if he committed another crime. Well, just 4 years after Rivers' murder, Con was once again arrested and charged with murdering a man named Jerome Peak at another house party in Minneapolis. This time, at Con's October 1998 trial, the defense portrayed him as a peacemaker who tried to stop the violence at the party. The result was an acquittal for Con, but also a prison sentence. After the not guilty verdict, a judge found Con in violation of his probation and ordered him to serve the remainder of his prison sentence. He stayed behind bars until 2006. As his release date got closer, he began to put his plan in motion to unite the Native mob, stop the infighting, and install discipline in the group. In 2004, he wrote a letter from prison to a close friend and confidant named Kenny Roberts, a longtime Native mob member who had proved his worth time and time again. Roberts' cousin had been killed by Native gangster Disciple, ending a peace treaty with them and further cementing Roberts' loyalty to the mob. Con wrote to Roberts, Quote, "The potential was there. We just need confidence in the leadership after we clean house. Get rid of a few studs that have been holding us back from growth. Shit is going to get real once again. I believe in that 100%. When Khan got out, Roberts was made war chief, a very important role that can include assisting with planned violence, keeping track of firearms, and dishing out punishment for violations. But even before he got out of prison, Khan was instantly thrust into controversy when Leech Lake Reservation leaders actually considered banishing him from the reservation due to his criminal record and alleged gang leadership. Reflecting years later, he said, quote, "It was very discouraging to go through that, to actually come that close to getting banished. It was scary. I didn't deserve it." The probation department ultimately assuaged the banishment talk by reassuring the public that they would do a good job monitoring Khan. What came next was a reorganization of the native mob that took steps towards stopping internal conflicts and which brought structure to the gang. Geographic reps were named. A man named Chris Worry, aka Lil White, served as treasurer and later as co-chief. Another native mob member named Sean Martinez was also given the co-chief title at times. The gang started holding councils on the second Saturday of every month, where reps from different areas would take roll call, check in, and discuss various issues and business. Khan and Lil White were also roommates at the same Cass Lake home at 316 Maple Avenue Northeast, which became affectionately known as the White House. It was there that Lil White would cook up crack cocaine for distribution, after obtaining powder from various sources around Minnesota. But unlike many of the criminal organizations we've covered here, the native mob did not appear to be raking in millions in drug profits. Members who later flipped and testified against the gang described buying small amounts, even just a few grams, for redistribution. And the big haul of the native mob investigation was a 2008 traffic stop that yielded a couple pounds of pot in a backpack. So unless these informants got it totally wrong or were lying to cover things up, it sounds like the members who sold drugs were scraping out a living by selling to a handful of drug addicts in their areas. That, in turn, made eliminating the competition much more important, though oftentimes native mob members would simply try to intimidate rival gang members or drug dealers by shooting up their home, rather than going straight to murder, according to the prosecution's own theory. That brings us to 2010, and the aftermath of the Amos LeDuc shooting, when the federal government decided to ramp up the investigation into the native mob. It did so in a typical fashion, by targeting native mob members and associates who seemed willing to turn informant, hitting them with serious charges, then essentially strong-arming them into turning on their brothers. But by their own admission, the federal government had never had much success getting native mob members to flip before this. And in July 2010, just 4 months after the LeDuc shooting, they received another stark reminder of how little the native mob tolerates snitches, when William Morris popped a cup of water in a microwave at the Crow Wing County Jail, let it boil for 4 minutes, then tossed it onto a man named Richard Norton for allegedly cooperating with police. It was just another run-in with what would become a chain of events involving snitches, retaliation, and violence during the investigation. It turned out that the fear of a lengthy prison sentence was enough to break certain people in the gang, and information started coming in. Soon, there was enough evidence to implicate Worry in cocaine trafficking and that MacArthur and Worry were stashing guns at the White House. A warrant was drafted to search the place on February 17, 2011. And though police found some gang indicia, they basically walked away empty-handed. But prosecutors claim that afterwards, MacArthur was furious, and he figured there must be a loose thread. Suspicion started falling on a relatively new native mob member named Jeremy Kraske. Like many who joined the native mob, Kraske spent much of his life searching for direction. He was born in Minneapolis, but spent part of his youth in Cass Lake. He was an avid fisherman, and though he had some arrests for drug dealing in his early 20s, he'd recently found work as a machinist at the Red Lake Reservation. In late 2010, he shocked his mother by telling her, quote, "Mom, you are no longer my family. I have a new family. I'm a part of the native mob now." But he was still a devoted family man who loved his children, and on February 25, 2011, he attended a parents' night for his daughter's high school basketball team, 2 hours away from Minneapolis. Eyewitnesses would later recount that Kraske got a call, told the person he didn't want to do whatever was being asked of him, but then saw Lil White. The two got into a heated discussion, after which Kraske told his daughter that he needed to go to Minneapolis. The following day, Kraske's body was found lying on the snow in the backyard of a South Minneapolis home. He'd been shot once in the back of the head and twice in the abdomen, and there were no indications the gunshots were preceded by a struggle. The native mob called an emergency meeting, in which two members were told not to retaliate until the gang's leadership figured out who was responsible for Kraske's death. Of course, police were also working hard to figure out who was responsible, and a big break would come just a week later when one of the many informants did a controlled cocaine buy for the federal government. His name was Michael Dopeboy Hasimovich, and he had been wearing a wire for months, not just for drug deals, but to record native mob councils. On March 3, 2011, he strapped the wire to his chest once again, discussed code words with DEA Special Agent Travis Ocken to alert him if he were to get into trouble, and went to buy a small amount of cocaine from Sean Martinez. But Martinez was in a talkative mood. As U.S. Attorney Andrew Winter would later recount, quote, "In hushed tones, Martinez confided that Kraske was viewed by the gang as a snitch, and that the gang's leader, Joaquin MacArthur, had asked him to commit the murder. Martinez described the middle-of-the-night execution, but urged the informant not to mourn Kraske's death because, as Martinez emphasized, Kraske was bogus." Family members later told police Kraske had been trying to distance himself from the native mob, but police say Kraske was not one of the people who'd become an informant. As it turned out, one of the men responsible for the search warrant on the White House was a lot closer to the top of the gang's leadership than the likes of Kraske. 8 months later, Martinez was in jail for a probation violation. By early 2012, the RICO indictment against the native mob was secured. All told, 30 native mob members were prosecuted in connection with the probe. All but 3 of them accepted plea deals, including Sean Martinez, who admitted to murdering his one-time friend and took a 43-year federal prison sentence. The 3 holdouts were Anthony Cree and William Morris, the alleged driver and shooter of Amos LeDuc, and of course, Joaquin MacArthur, who would go on to testify in his own defense, denying all of the allegations and rebutting the notion that the native mob was anything more than a close-knit family. As the trial date got closer, though, prosecutors had to reveal who their confidential sources were, and one name was a bombshell. It was Kenny Roberts, the native mob's war chief, who had agreed to not only aid in the investigation but to testify at the trial. As a matter of fact, Roberts, not Kraske, was one of the confidential informants who had given information about the White House that led authorities to serving a search warrant there the week before Kraske was killed. But with that revelation came a potential scandal. If the native mob had, in fact, orchestrated a pre-planned murder of one of their own, as the feds claimed, how likely was it that this was carried out without the knowledge of the man assigned as the gang's war chief? And if it was true that Khan and others believed Kraske to be a snitch, who put that idea in their head to begin with? When it came time for Roberts to testify at the trial, he revealed that he had flipped after being arrested for having a gun and cocaine in October 2010, and talked about Amos LeDuc being a target for having cooperated against a native mob member named Muka, who shot his own cousin in a family dispute. But prosecutors ended the questioning early, rather than question Roberts about activities on or around February 2011, staving off the defense's ability to cross-examine him about it. When it came time for the defense to argue, they called the feds' attempt to use the RICO statute the stretch of the century, once again portraying Khan as a peacemaker who was trying to bring structure to the native mob to reduce violence and disorderly conduct, but describing the crimes alleged in the indictment as, quote, impetuous, unthinking conduct by wild, undisciplined boys and young men, as opposed to organized crime. Remember, Federal prosecutors must not only prove the crimes, but that they were part of a criminal organization for RICO to apply. Kahn's attorney, Frederick Getz, went a step further than that. Quote, "Joaquin MacArthur is as much a leader of this group as anyone could be who has ever tried to herd a bunch of cats," he told the jury. William Morris got on the stand and admitted to shooting Amos, but said it was for personal reasons, and denied even being a Native Mob member. Similarly, Kahn not only disavowed Morris' alleged Native Mob ties, but called the Amos LeDuc shooting a, quote, cowardly act that he wanted no part of. He testified that he still mourned the loss of Kraske, that it was painful to even think about, and that he knew prosecutors were trying to hurt him by dwelling on the tragedy so much. "I don't qualify for RICO," he said. "The Native Mob was about surviving, that's all. Whether it be amongst ourselves, surviving from each other, surviving the elements of our society. We're a product of society. I was given this world. I didn't make it." In the end, jurors convicted the group of racketeering and other charges, and they were all given decades in prison. Their sentences are still up for appeal, so it is possible that they will earn reduced time as the years go by. But the story doesn't quite end there. In 2019, a Native Mob member named Dakota James LaFave was sentenced to 366 months in federal prison for assault with a dangerous weapon in aid of racketeering. It stemmed from yet another example of witness retaliation 2 years earlier, when LaFave realized he was riding in the same car with a man who'd been part of the Native Mob and had testified against them years earlier in a RICO trial. The victim was shot in the back, but survived. Authorities have never disclosed his name, but they did release his initials in the charging records, which provide little doubt of who it could be. K.R.